Okay, good morning, everyone. I see people are sort of popping in here. We've got a handful of people. Good morning to you, Jenna and Monica. Morning, Banamer. Good morning, Casey. Good morning, Manish and Mashid. Hello. Tika's here. Good morning. And Duong. Good morning to you all. You guys doing okay? If you're in Vancouver here, you can see it's a little bit kind of a cloudy day, so I don't know. Would have been nice if it was sunny, but that's all right. Erica's here. Good morning, Erica. Or good evening, Erica. I guess it's pretty late for you. Let's see. Baja's here. Good morning. Okay. All right. So here, people. Here's what we'll do today. Um, we will just kind of tie up this unit of socialization and culture that we've been talking about. That won't be the end of talking about socialization because it will continue to be an important part of what we talk about going forward. But we'll end that for now and we'll move on to oppression and power. And so this will be a short unit, but it'll be an important one because all the other things that we talk about in this course, like sexism or racism or religious oppression or all of those things, all of those are types of oppression. Okay, so this unit will kind of be a bit of a foundation to understand all of those other types of oppression because we'll be talking about what oppression actually is. Okay, Ivan, good morning to you, or good evening to you, I guess. Yeah, so that's what we'll do. So I'll talk for a little bit. I have an article for you to read that has some important definitions for us to know. It describes a few very interesting psychological studies that may give us a little bit of background or better understanding into how humans behave in groups. And so I'll talk for a little bit, we'll read, we'll answer some questions, and then we'll talk about the answers to those questions and kind of what it means for looking at oppression and looking at social justice stuff. Okay, so that's kind of how today will go, I think. So without further delay, let's hop in here. Oh yeah, so I marked your homework finally. Sorry, it took me a little while to do that. And just very quickly, this is what I asked you to do, right? I asked you to think of a societal norm, one that you feel is important, but one you feel that people don't always follow or that they're not sure about. And so I asked you to describe how people violate the norm and then explain the consequences that might follow. And so I think most people did a reasonably good job of that. I marked it fairly soft. Sorry, I'm just going to sneeze here. Okay, sorry, I'm back. um, Most people did a reasonably good job of this. I marked it fairly soft, so I wasn't really hard on you when I marked it. Um, how I was marking it was this, and so first of all, I looked and saw, did you do the thing that I asked you to do? Right, that's a that's a very easy one. Did you do what I asked you to do? Second, to make sure. I was looking to make sure that you understood what a norm was. Okay, so we had talked about what norms were in class. We had read that section of the textbook, and so um, in your homework reflection, I just wanted to see that you understood what a norm was. And so some people talked about what we would describe as formal norms. Some people talked about informal norms. Both of those are okay. I just wanted to see evidence that you understood what a norm is. Um, did you explain the sort of cause and consequence? So did you explain to me how the norm is violated and then how people are sanctioned or punished? And this last part, I just wanted to see that you were actually thinking about it. Okay. Good morning, Jimmy. I wanted to see that you were actually thinking about it. And maybe something I'll say here is that in this class, especially in this sort of online format, really what I want to see is evidence of you thinking about things. Okay, and so um, we're going to try and sort of move away from a focus on sort of just knowledge and just right answers, and move to a space where we're thinking about things and we're asking questions and trying to connect those to our own experience. That's kind of where I want to. That's where I want to sort of point us. And so that's kind of what I was looking for in this exercise. Is I was looking for not did you have the right answer, or not did you say it as quickly as you could, but were you kind of thinking about this idea of norms and the violation of them and what that kind of means when people break it. Okay, so some of those are a little bit abstract. Sometimes they're a little difficult to score, but that's what I was trying to do. I was trying to look for evidence of you thinking about these things a little bit, even though it was a really short assignment. Okay. Nevertheless, I did grade them, and I posted the grades on Student Portal. Okay. That said, moving on. Yesterday we finished watching Mean Girls, right? And I think the people that reviewed it, I think, seem to have enjoyed it. I think it's a good movie. It's getting a little dated now, being 16 years old, but I think it's still relevant in a lot of ways. And so I think it's relevant in terms of young people having an experience in school, maybe trying to, getting into conflicts with their friends sometimes, maybe getting into conflicts with their parents, trying to figure out who they are. And so there's that aspect to Mean Girls. But I also think there's a very important way of looking at this film that is kind of sociological. And so, yeah, it's an entertaining film. It has a good message, particularly for young women. If you didn't know, the woman who plays the math teacher, Miss Norbury, she's the screenwriter for Mean Girls, and so she kind of wrote this movie. So the movie itself, I think, demonstrates a few aspects of the power of socialization and how social norms are kind of created and reinforced in a group. So here's kind of what I want us to. We answered all these questions here. Here's what I want us to take away. Here's what I want us to take away from Mean Girls. Number one, that we have all been socialized, right? In our whatever society or whatever culture we grew up in, we've all learned a set of social norms and values and beliefs. In many cases, we learn these things without our knowledge or consent. Okay, so we kind of internalize social messages without really being aware of. Whoops, I got a little typo there. I'll fix that. Without being aware, and then okay, I've just got an extra space. And then those social messages will influence our behavior in certain ways, and we see that in a lot of different. We see that take place in a lot of different ways in Mean Girls. The other thing I want to point out here is that social rules are arbitrary, right? And so that's very evident when we look at the rules that govern the plastics, right? They have rules about wearing pink on Wednesday and ponytail only once a week, and various other rules that govern their appearance, but they're all kind of made up, right? There's no reason why somebody has to wear pink on Wednesday. It doesn't really matter. But the girls have made up this rule, and then they enforce it, right? And so if you break the rule, you can't sit with them at lunch. And so it doesn't matter. In this case, it doesn't really matter how silly the rule is. The rule is still enforced one way or the other. And so many of our social rules, many of our social norms are enforced that way too. They're kind of made up. There's no reason why they have to be followed, but if people don't follow them, we kind of punish them anyway. The other thing I want to point out here from Mean Girls is that most societies have a hierarchy. So that's a system that organizes groups in terms of status and authority. And so if I asked you, and if we were in real class, I would, but if I asked you, who are the groups, the social groups in this high school that have the most power, I think you would probably tell me that the plastics do. I think you would probably tell me that the jocks do, the football players do. And if I asked you who has the least power, you might say Damien and Janice. You might say the desperate wannabes or the band geeks. You would kind of instinctively know who has power in this high school, right? And so societies are the same, right? Societies have different social groups. Some of those groups have power and authority and opportunity, and some groups do not. Okay, and we'll dig much more into that as we go forward. And of course, where we sit in that hierarchy, where we sit in that social structure, has a lot to do with the social groups we belong to. And so, for instance, in Mean Girls, Gretchen is kind of at the top of the social pyramid. She's at the top of the social structure, mostly because she belongs to the plastics, right? She belongs to a group that is up at the top. And again, our position or the social groups that we belong to determine how others in society treat us and what advantages and opportunities we might or might not have. And so I'll go back to Gretchen here. Gretchen understands that, right? Because she says that it's better to be in a group than to be outside of it, right? Because Gretchen knows all of the benefits she gets for being in the plastics, right? The way that people look up to her and respect her. Good morning, Krish. The way that they look up to her and respect her. If she wasn't part of the group, she might not get that, right? And so even though she goes through that period in the movie where she's really unhappy, she doesn't want to leave the group, right? And because she doesn't want to kind of lose the benefit of being part of that. Now, let me just take this a step further here. So the social groups we belong to, they kind of form a set of glasses that we wear, okay? So a lens that we look through in society. And so what I'm talking about here, and maybe I should have added a few more words to this slide, but I said that the social messages that we absorb them sometimes without knowing, and they become part of our programming, right? They become part of our operating system. And as a result, we start to see the world through these values and beliefs, right? We interpret the world around us and people's actions based on the things that we believe and the things that we value, okay? And so, again, they kind of become like the lenses of glasses when we look out at the world. And again, whether we like it or not, we receive these messages anyway, okay? And we get them from a number of different sources. Now, this is a difficult thing to sometimes understand because we are socialized to see ourselves as individuals. Remember when I asked you, this is probably last week. Good morning, Justin. I asked you last week about your identity, right? And you told me things like you were funny, or you were outgoing, or you were friendly, or compassionate, or silly. You gave me all of these descriptions of what you were like. And all of those are personal characteristics, right? Very few of you refer to yourself as members of social groups. So very few of you said that you were male or female. Very few of you said that you belonged to a certain religious or racial or ethnic group. So we have been socialized to see ourselves as individuals, right? We've been socialized to think of ourselves as unique people in the world, right? We're single people, but we're also members of larger social groups, but we're not often socialized to see ourselves this way. And so In this class, we're going to pay a little more attention to the social group we belong to and how that changes our perception of the world, right? That's that positionality thing that we were talking about earlier. Um, so we've kind of been socialized, or we've been taught that social group memberships don't matter, right? That it doesn't matter what your gender or race or ethnicity or religion is, that, you know, we're all kind of unique individuals and those group memberships don't matter. But they do. They do matter. Um, so where I'm kind of taking this, I'm just going to jump forward here to this next unit here, which is oppression and power. Okay, and again, like I mentioned earlier, it's going to be important to understand what oppression is, because all of the other things that we talk about in this class, sexism, racism, religious oppression, um, colonialism, all of those things are different types of oppression. So we have to understand what oppression is to, you know, to understand those, right? So I'll take you back here to Mean Girls for one moment. So you'll probably you'll probably recognize this. This is the map, right? This is the map that Janice drew for Katie so that she understood the cafeteria and the social groups, right? And so um, Janice went through and described all of these different social groups that exist in the high school, and she drew a nice little map for Katie of where everyone sits, okay? Now, what's kind of interesting about many of these groups, what was very interesting about many of these groups is that they are created in ways that, let me back up here. Society often organizes groups into binary opposites, okay? And so for those of you in comparative cultures, you might remember this from structuralism, I believe. So the idea that we've always got two extremes, and culture tries to give us a middle ground, right? It tries to figure out the middle ground between two extremes. And so the idea here is that people often like to create categories based on the extremes of two things. So up and down, left and right, good and bad, hot and cold. And in the case of the social groups in Mean Girls, they can often be described as with a set of binary oppositions, with two things that are opposite. And so if we talked about the jocks, the football players, are they smart or dumb? Stereotypically, and most people would say that they're dumb, right? Are they popular or not popular? They're popular, right? The Asian nerds, are they cool or not cool? They're not cool. Are they smart or dumb? They're smart. Are they good looking or not good looking? We would probably say they're not good looking, right? Same thing with the plastics. Are they smart or dumb? Stereotypically, they're dumb, right? Are they good looking or not good looking? They're good looking. Are they popular or not popular? They're popular. So we can very quickly describe a lot of the groups in this high school based on binary oppositions between one category or the other, okay? And so societies often do this, and it's a bit of a lazy approach. It doesn't really work very well, and well, maybe I'll jump right in and say this. The categories are artificial, okay? They're made up, they're arbitrary. But societies like to divide people up this way anyway, okay? So part of the function of this is that it allows people to kind of figure out who they are, okay? And so if you belong to a social group, so in my case, if I'm a man, in my society, I know what it means to be a man. I know what men are kind of supposed to be like. I know how they're supposed to act and supposed to dress. And so that becomes part of my identity. I know how I'm supposed to behave, but I'm supposed to behave like a man in my society. But part of that is also that I am not supposed to behave like a woman, right? Because women behave differently, they dress differently. And so I'm defining myself by what I am, but I'm also defining myself by what I am not, right? I am this thing, I am a man, and I'm not that thing over there. I'm not a woman, right? So these binary opposites, these two categories, help us to figure out parts of our identity. They tell us how we should behave in society, and we sort of simultaneously define ourselves by what we are and by what we're not, right? So I am a man, I am not a woman. So I do these things and like these things and behave in this way, and I don't do those things and I don't behave in that way. Okay, so I feel like I'm doing a really bad job explaining that, but it will become more clear. At least I really hope so. Yeah, so the groups in the high school at Mean Girls, they can be understood this way, right? We can describe all of the groups or many of the groups at the high school according to these binary opposites, right? Popular or not. Are they girls or guys? Are they attractive or not attractive? Are they smart or are they not smart? And pretty interestingly, lots of the groups can be defined by one extreme or the other, right? Now, in real societies, we have similar categories, but of course we don't have, Asian nerds and jocks and burnouts and things like that. We do, but in real societies, we have different social categories. We have different social groups, right? And so we have groups such as race, right? We have groups such as class, economic, social class. We have groups for gender and sexuality and physical ability and religion and nationality. And so just like in Mean Girls, social groups in society have different amounts of power, right? And so in Mean Girls, the plastics have a lot of social power, the jocks have a lot of social power, and they use that in certain ways, right? The plastics seem to be allowed to treat people however they want, right? And people continue to look up to them and respect them and idolize them, right? They have a lot of social power. And it's the same thing in real societies. Real societies have groups that have more power and more opportunity than others. And so the relationship between those groups, between groups that have power and groups that don't, is called oppression, okay? And this is what we'll say oppression is. So we'll say that oppression is a set of policies, okay? A set of policies, we'll talk about policies later, practices, traditions, norms, definitions, and explanations that function to systematically exploit one social group to the benefit of another social group, okay? So oppression has a lot of different elements to it, as you can see, right? There is things that people do, practices and traditions. There's things that people are supposed to do. There are norms. There are definitions, how we define things, how we explain things. There are policies in terms of how we approach certain problems. And all of these things work together to benefit one group at the expense of another group, okay? And so as we go forward, we'll call the group that benefits, we'll call the dominant group, okay? And the group that's exploited, we'll call the minoritized group. And so in Mean Girls, we could pretty clearly say that the plastics are the dominant group, right? They're the ones that have social power. They're the ones that control, to some degree, they control the beliefs and norms of the high school society, right? Things that they do and things that they say are followed and respected, right? They kind of set trends. The way that they dress, other people try to dress like them. The way that they act, other people like to or try to act like them. So the plastics are a dominant group in the high school society. Other groups are minoritized groups. Now, in real life, we have similar situations, and so I've kind of summarized it here with this chart. And as you can see, again, we've kind of divided things up into a binary. We've kind of divided things up into two opposing sides, the dominant and the minoritized group. And again, the relationship between them, the relationship between those groups is defined as an oppression, right? So if you look right at the top, we have racism, and racism is defined as an oppressive relationship between white people and people of color. And of course, all of these dominant and minoritized groups are kind of organized based on Western society. And so if you live in another country, if you live in a different society, the dominant and minoritized groups are going to be a little bit different, right? Depending on which social groups are in your society. And so this chart is reflective of kind of what's happening in Western countries. It doesn't work for all countries, okay? So as we can see here, white people are in an oppressive relationship with peoples of color, right? And so in Western society, just like with the plastics, social and, in our case, political power is held by white people. And so white people have more opportunities and advantages as compared to people of color, right? The same thing if we skip down to sexism, right? Sexism is an oppression that describes the relationship between men, you'll see it says cis men there, but we'll get to that a little bit later, between men and between non-male genders. So for the most part, women, but also people who are transgender or genderqueer or gender non-binary. Those people are minoritized groups, and they are because men are the dominant group in basically all societies, right? Men have political power, men have social power, and so they have more advantages and opportunities as compared to those people in minoritized groups. Same thing with religious oppression. So here in the West, people who are broadly Christian, whether they're Catholic or Protestant or members of other Christian churches, Christianity is kind of the dominant group here in most Western countries. And so non-Christian religions fall into minoritized groups. So Muslims, Buddhists, Jews, Hindus, and other non-Christians are in the minoritized group. And so again, society is sort of organized in a way that benefits Christians and disadvantages those non-Christian groups, okay? So as you can see here, there's a number of different oppressions that can be active. And again, they describe the relationship between groups, specifically the group that's dominant in society, so the group that has power, and groups that have less power, okay? It might be useful to point out here, and I'll come back to this, but because oppression and because things like racism and sexism and so on, because they describe a power relationship, you can't have the reverse of it, okay? So for racism, let's say, racism describes the relationship between white people and peoples of color, okay? And white people, we said, in Western societies have power. They have social and political and economic power, and peoples of color have less. That relationship is racism, right? The fact that one group has power over the other. But for that reason, you can't have reverse racism, okay? You may have heard some people throwing around this idea of reverse racism. The way that we're defining these things, you can't really have that, right? Because because the power system stays, right? It doesn't matter what people of color say about white people. It doesn't matter if they do certain things, unless that power relationship changes, unless somehow people of color gain social and political power within a society, they can't really be racist against white people. Only white people can be racist against people of color. And so that doesn't mean that there can't be stereotypes. It doesn't mean that there can't be prejudicial statements said. It doesn't mean that there can't be discrimination, but you can't have reverse racism. You can't have reverse sexism, because racism and sexism and religious oppression, they all describe a power relationship. And so if the group that has power, if that doesn't change, then the racism or sexism or whatever the oppression is, it only kind of goes one way. Okay, so you can't really have the reverse. So let me press pause there for a second and check in with you. Do you have any questions for me? And I wouldn't be surprised if you did, because I don't think I did a phenomenal job explaining what I wanted to explain. But how's that sitting with you? Do you have some questions? Is there things that you didn't understand from that section that you'd like me to talk about a little more? Because I would like to. Because I felt that was a little shaky. But sometimes that happens. These things aren't rehearsed, right? So what do you think about that? So we've talked a little bit about social groups, talked a little bit about social hierarchies, and now we're into oppression. So, okay, so Baha's good, Casey's good. Let's see here. How does oppression come in between minority and majority? Okay, a couple things there. We will talk more about both of these things as we go forward. So the origins of oppression are generally historical, right? So there's usually historical reasons for why one group gains power over another. It often has to do with a lot of different factors, and it also has to do with different historical events. So here in the West, let's say, the reason that men have power is not entirely the same reason that white people have power, right? Those are the result of different historical processes and different historical events. But if you look kind of far enough back, you will see specific reasons or specific events that have put one group in power and left another one with less power or without power. The other part of your question here, and this will come up a little bit later, Karen, but we'll talk about it right now. When you talk about oppression doesn't have to do with majorities or minorities, okay? It has to do with who has the power in society. And so there's probably better sort of political examples of this, but the one that's coming to my mind now is here in Canada, men are the dominant group, right? Men have social, political, economic power, and women have less, right? So men are in this kind of oppressive relationship with women. But men are not the majority in Canada. There are actually more women than men. And of course, it's pretty close to 50-50. I think it's 48% to 52% or something, so it's very close. But regardless, men are still the minority in Canada. But the numbers don't matter so much. The numbers, what matters is who has who has power, right? Who controls society's politics and economy and social institutions. And in the case of Canada, it's still mostly men. And so men are still the dominant group. Their numbers don't matter so much. I don't know if that helped. Baha says, what was the type before Christian? Well, it depends where you're talking. Here in sort of Canada and the US, Europeans brought their Christianity with them. And so if you're looking for, say, in North America, kind of the original religion here was the religious practices that First Nations people engaged in. That would have been kind of the original religion. But of course, European settlers came starting in the 1500s, and they started to settle here in North America. They brought their Christianity with them, and they sort of took over and then spread their religion. And so for them, for Christianity here in North America, the spread of Christianity is connected to the spread of white people, and so those two things are connected, I think, in North America. The fact that Christians have power and the fact that white people have power is connected because white people were Christian when they first came. And of course, Christianity has spread to other racial and ethnic groups within North America, but it sort of came with them. Sorry. I misunderstood your question there. What was the type before Christian in the chart? Do you mean the heterosexism thing, Baha? Is that what you're talking about? Is that what you're talking about? Okay, sometimes I do that. Okay, so above Christians here we have heterosexism, okay, and that's kind of a term that maybe you don't hear very often, but it does describe an oppression that happens within Western society. So here in sort of Canada and the US, the dominant group are heterosexuals, right? People who are sexually attracted to the opposite gender. So men for women and women for men. Those are the dominant group. They happen to be in the majority as well, but social power is generally held by heterosexuals. And so gay people, lesbian people, bisexual, pansexual, those groups do not generally have social power in our society, okay? And so there is a power differential between heterosexuals and between people who are not strictly heterosexual, who are not straight. You don't often hear about it described that way. You don't often hear the word heterosexism used very often, but it does have to do with people's sexual orientation and sexual behavior. And so heterosexuals are the dominant group in society. I hope that helps. I'm sorry that I answered the wrong question there. Sometimes that happens. Okay, so there's all kinds of different oppressive relationships that can happen in a society between different social groups, and Again, here you can see sometimes it has to do with race, sometimes it has to do with economic class, sometimes it has to do with gender, sometimes it has to do with sexual orientation or sexual identity, sometimes it has to do with religion or physical ability, or sort of national or nationality, or it has to do with colonialism. And so it has to do with, in Western countries anyway, white people in an oppressive relationship with First Nations people. So, as I was kind of leading into there before, oppression is different than simple prejudice or discrimination. And we'll, in the article I'm going to have you read, we'll get a better definition of both of those things, prejudice and discrimination. So I said that oppression is connected to power. Okay, so oppression occurs when one group's ideas of how society should be is backed up by legal authority and by historical and social and institutional power. We'll come to that a little bit later, but those are kind of the types of power that a dominant group can have. They can have legal power, they can have kind of historical precedence, so they're in power because they historically have always been in power. They can have social power, and they can have institutional power. They can control society's institutions like the family or government or education or the military or so on. Okay, so that brings us to this article that I would like you to read. So the article is called Psychological Theories of Prejudice and Discrimination. And so you will find the article on Student Portal under Course Documents, or you will find it in Microsoft Teams under Files, okay? And so the article itself has a number of definitions to start off with, and then it will describe a few psychological experiments, which are pretty interesting, actually. And so what I would like you to do is, it's 8:48 now, so what I'll say is take a 10-minute break, and then I'll give you about, let's say about 20 minutes, okay? I'll give you about 20 minutes and we'll read as far as you can. If you can finish the article in 20 minutes, great. If you can't, get as far as you can and answer as many questions as you can. Don't forget to type them out so we can put them into the live chat here. And so that will be, so what we'll do is at 9:20 we'll come back and we'll talk about some of the things that we've read in this article, okay? Does that make sense? Maybe give me a quick thumbs up if it's good, or a thumbs down if it's bad, or a question if you have a question. What do you think of that? So 10-minute break, read the article, answer the questions. The article and the questions are both in Student Portal and on Microsoft Teams under Files. And then at 9:20 we will come back and we'll talk about those things. Okay, so Bo's good, Jenna's good, Jimmy's good, Casey's good, Sam's good, Karen's good, Eric is good. Okay. So as you're reading, if you have any questions, I am here. I'm not going to leave the building. I will be at my computer. So if you have any questions, you can put them into the live chat, or you can put them in Microsoft Teams and I'll answer them. But other than that, maybe go take your 10-minute break, start back at 9, start reading that article, and then we'll try to answer some of the questions at 9:20, okay? So I'll see you shortly, okay? Okay, and we're back. So let me know in the comments here or in the live chat, how far did you get in the article? Did you get to page 2 or to page 4, or did you finish it, or how far did you get? Sometimes it's tough for me to know exactly how much time you need to read something, so um, let me know how far you got. So did you get partway through? Did you get all the way through? Let's see. Okay, Baja's about halfway through. Okay. Christian's about halfway through. Okay. Erica's a little further. Page 4. Page 3. Okay. Okay, that's good to know. See if anyone else wants to answer. If you made it about halfway through, that's okay. We'll deal with that. Again, it's tough for me to know how much time you need. So maybe we'll start out. This little article has a lot of interesting things in it. Halfway through, okay, Ivan and Karen. Okay, that's cool. This article has a lot of interesting things in it. It's not extremely well written, unfortunately. So if you struggled to kind of read your way through it, that's okay. I think it's a bit of a mess in terms of how it's written, but that's okay. The stuff that's in it is good, and we'll pull out what we need. Okay. So I think the first question I asked you was what is a stereotype? What is a stereotype? So let me know in the comments there. What's a stereotype? And you probably heard that term used before. I'm sure it's come up for you kind of in your regular life. But what do they say it is here? What is a stereotype? So Casey says here, a stereotype is an attitude toward a person based on their behavior or their characteristics. Yes. Karen says, yeah, basing someone's characteristics on their appearance. That's good too. What else do we have? Those are both correct, by the way, Casey and Karen. Good work. What else do we have? Erica, an attitude toward a person or a group on the basis of some physical characteristic or physical fact. Yes, that's good too. Sam says, look at you guys, good work. Stereotype is a judgment between a person or a group of people based on how they look. Yeah. So kind of in simplest form, you're all correct, by the way. What a stereotype is the idea that we can determine what people are like based on their appearance, right? And so we see someone, their image hits our eyes, and based on what we see, we can determine certain things about them, right? And so, yeah, your thoughts on physical traits of a group of people. Yeah, so it has to do with things that we usually see with our eyes, right? So we might see an old person, and we might stereotypically know what old people are like, right? And we kind of exposed or talked about some of those when we did that exercise with all of those people's faces, if you remember. Some of what we were using to figure out who was the smartest or the wealthiest or whatever, part of what we were using was our knowledge of stereotypes, right? We saw this old person's photo, we have some ideas about what old people are like, and so when we see this old person, these stereotypes come to mind, right? These ideas of what that person is like. And so, yeah, you're all very correct, right? The idea that we can determine things about someone based on the way they look, right? And so, or some sort of aspect about them. And so the the article made a distinction between two types of stereotypes: individual and group. I think it said the individual stereotypes were describing an individual based on what we see about them. So there was discussion of names and sort of associations of names or association of what someone looks like. And then there's group stereotypes. So ideas that we kind of know in quotes, we know what a certain group is like, and so if you belong to that group, that tells us something about who you are, right? And yeah, and so we should probably say at this point that some of this is natural, okay? So we want to, as we get further into this, we'll talk about stereotypes and prejudice and discrimination, and we'll talk about negative outcomes of all of those things. But we probably should add at the very beginning that some of this is natural human behavior, right? It's useful for human brains to organize the universe according to categories, right? It's useful for our brains to try to identify patterns, right? And so let's use older people, for instance. If we kind of know what older people are like, it makes it easier for us to interact with older people or to meet a new older person, right? It's because we have some idea of what they're like. And sometimes our assumptions are proved right, sometimes our assumptions are proved wrong, but it makes it easier for us if we can group people into categories and make a few guesses about what they're like, right? That just makes it easier for our brains to operate in society, right? So a certain amount of stereotyping is kind of natural, right? It's a way in which our brain tries to organize the universe so that it doesn't have to figure out everything brand new every time. Okay, so there's something kind of natural going on here. Now, the second question I asked you was this: what is prejudice? So prejudice is a little bit different than stereotype, and it's sometimes it's difficult to tell the difference between one or the other. And so we'll try and explain that, but let's see what we come up with. What is prejudice, and how is it kind of different from what a stereotype is? How is it different from what a stereotype is? Let's see. What did you say? Okay, so Erica says it's an extreme stereotype. Okay, so the article does explain it that way, and they say because it can progress to further stages. That's true. What else? Jimmy says prejudice is an opinion, not depending on experiences or rules. Yeah, it has to do with an opinion. That's correct, Jimmy. We want to go further with that. An opinion that's not based on reasons. That's also true. What else? I think we're getting there. We're headed in the right direction. Karen says, okay, this is an opinion or perception of someone with no reasons or evidence. Yep, that's true. I'll just give you another second. One of the things that differentiates a prejudice from a stereotype, and I think some of you are kind of bumping up against it here, is the idea that there's an opinion or a value judgment that's part of it. Okay, so stereotypes are often kind of value neutral. So we're not saying people are good or bad. We're just kind of saying how they are. Prejudices have ideas about good or bad as part of that idea. Okay. So Thika says it's a rule of society or a group of people, and maybe it's not fair. That's true. Prejudices often aren't fair, right? Because they pass judgment on people based on ideas that may or may not be true, or have kind of certain elements of truth but are not entirely true. So if you say, for instance, here's a stereotype. So a stereotype is that Canadians say "a" all the time. We say "a" at the end of our sentences. "A," that's what we say, eh? So that's a kind of a stereotype. Now, Canadians saying "a" is something that is kind of, I don't know, widely known, but people know it about Canadians. It's something that they do. They say "a" at the end of their sentences. Is there an element of truth to it? Yeah, sometimes we say "a." Sometimes people say "a" a lot. But it's not true of everyone. Not everyone says "a." I don't think I say it very often. But there's no real value judgment to that. We're not saying it's good or bad, right? We're just saying that's what it is, right? We're not saying Canadians are bad because they say "a," or they're good because they say "a." It's kind of, it doesn't really have any opinion or value attached to it. But prejudices do, right? Prejudices say that people are a certain way, and that certain way has a good or bad connotation to it, right? So people are, this group of people are really smart or really dumb or really aggressive or really lazy or really whatever, right? All of those are value judgments, right? You're saying something either positive or negative about a group of people, right? And so prejudices can be positive or negative, right? So you can say one kind of prejudicial statement. No, I won't say it. Yeah, let's leave it at that. So stereotypes are generalized ideas of what people are like. Sometimes there's an element of truth to them, but they don't apply to everyone. Prejudice is where the idea has a positive or negative judgment as part of it. Okay, so you're saying a group of people are, you're kind of judging them as good or bad based on your ideas. Okay. I'm not sure if that helps, but let's let's move on to this experiment by Aronson and Osherow. This one is really interesting. This is a really interesting experiment. Number one, it's very interesting because you really can't do an experiment like this anymore. This one was done, I forget if it was done in the 50s or 60s. You can't really study children this way. You can't really manipulate them this way. Now, if you go to a university and you try to do a psychological study, there'll be an ethics board. There'll be a group of people who will either allow you to do your study or not allow you to do your study based on the harm that it might do to the people in the study. And a study like this would not, I suspect, would not be allowed to happen now, because it kind of manipulates these children for science, and that's not good. But it was done before that time, and so it is really interesting. And so, as you probably read, there was a class of young students. I forget how old they are, maybe 6 or 7 or 8 years old, young children, and their teacher, Jane Elliott, told them that the brown-eyed children were smarter, right? So they said brown-eyed children are smarter and better behaved. Blue-eyed children, you guys aren't very smart, and you're bad. You always misbehave. And so some really interesting things happen, right? what happens in this study as a result? So the teacher starts to tell the brown-eyed children that they are smarter and better behaved, and she starts to tell the blue-eyed children that they are not as smart and they're little troublemakers. So what happens as a result of her telling those students that? What happens? So interesting and important. What happens? We have blue-eyed kids and brown-eyed kids. The brown-eyed kids are told they're smarter and better behaved. The blue-eyed kids are told they're not as smart, they're not as well behaved. What happens? Yeah, so Casey says, oops. So Casey says that the blue-eyed children started to do less well compared to the brown-eyed children. Yeah, and Baha says, yeah, that's maybe a little oversimplified, but I see where you're going with that Baha. Um, but Casey, yeah, you're right. The blue-eyed children start to do less well, and the brown-eyed children start to do better, right? And so, what's going on here, right? Because let me see, Erica. Yeah, the blue-eyed children become discouraged and they become less confident in doing their work, and the brown-eyed children start to and the brown-eyed children start to bully them as well, and the kids start to follow the stereotype, right? And so the brown-eyed children are told that they're smarter, and their test scores start to go up, and the blue-eyed children are told that they're not as smart, and their test scores start to go down. And so yeah, the question is what's going on, right? Because there is no correlation between intelligence and eye color, right? Blue-eyed people are not smarter than brown-eyed people. Brown-eyed people are not smarter than blue-eyed people. There's no connection between those two things, but it starts happening anyway. And so as Karen mentions here, the kids start following the stereotypes, right? And so kids start to sort of act out, they start to live up to the social messages they're receiving. The brown-eyed children do better, the blue-eyed children do worse, and then the brown-eyed children start picking on the blue-eyed children because they're not as smart and they're not as good, right? So that's very, very interesting. Now, what do you think this tells us about how prejudice works? What does this say about prejudice? Because basically that's what Jane Elliott is doing. That's what the teacher is doing in this class. She is spreading a prejudicial idea, right? She's saying blue-eyed kids are not smart and brown-eyed kids are really smart. She's making up a prejudice and she's spreading it around through her class. And what happens? Well, the prejudice kind of comes true in a way, right? It starts to happen. And so what does that tell us about prejudice and how it works? What does that tell us about prejudice and how it works? Okay, so Casey says, it shows us that words can influence or manipulate our minds to think and act in a certain way. That's very right. We'll give some specialized language. We'll give some specialized terminology to that, maybe tomorrow or the day after. But yeah, the ideas, the stereotypes and prejudicial ideas that circulate in society are powerful, right? And they do influence the way that people act, and they influence the way that people think about themselves, right? So these prejudicial ideas that are floating around, they kind of come true, right? And so, um, yeah. Um, yeah, Karen says the notions are not true. Yes, they are not true, but very interestingly, they begin to look true, right? And so, if you didn't know, this is interesting, if you didn't know anything about this class and you didn't know anything about the ideas that the teacher was spreading in this class, you might look at the test scores and you might think, well, brown eyed kids are a lot smarter than blue eyed kids. Just look at the test scores. You can see it, right? The data is right there. But if you don't look at the social environment, if you don't look at the types of ideas that are spreading around, then you're missing part of the picture, right? You think you're seeing a relationship between eye color and intelligence, but there is no relationship between eye color and intelligence. Something else is going on, right? There is a prejudicial idea that's influencing these kids in the classroom. It's influencing them to behave one way or another. And so, yeah, these sort of social messages that circulate around the classroom influence how these kids behave. It influences how they think about themselves, whether they think they're smart and good kids or whether they think they're not smart and not good kids. And it influences how they see other kids. And so the brown-eyed kids start to bully the blue-eyed kids. Really interesting, but really important as well, because we can see very similar things happening in different ways in society as a whole. Okay, so when we have different prejudicial ideas floating around, people are absorbing them, people are acting on them, sometimes without even knowing, and as a result, we get discrimination, right? And we get data that looks like it proves something, but actually it's not that way, right? And so that's exactly what's happening here in Jane's classroom, is that it looks as if the brown-eyed kids are smarter. If you look at the test scores, that's what it looks like, but that's not true, right? There's no connection between eye color and intelligence. Something else is happening. And in this class, what's happening is that there is a prejudice circulating that is influencing how these kids think about themselves. Okay? Try to remember that one, because that's an interesting study and will become useful for us later. So the last question I'll ask you really quickly here is, why do stereotypes remain so stable over time? And so we can think about this, ideas about what men are like or what women are like. We can think of certain racial or ethnic or religious groups. Lots of the sort of stereotypical and prejudicial ideas that are attached to those groups actually have been around for quite some time. I don't know if you know anything about anti-Semitism and sort of some of the prejudicial ideas that are attached to Jewish people, but if you look, those ideas go back hundreds of years, hundreds and hundreds of years. They are old ideas, but they have remained persistent for centuries, right? And we are still dealing with those prejudicial ideas today. And so why are they so stable? Why did these prejudices hang around for so long, and why are they difficult to change? So difficult to change. So Erica says people often only remember the facts that support their stereotype. Yes. The fancy word for this, Erica, let's see here. It's difficult to break down once formed. That is very true, Casey. Once we have stereotypes and prejudices circulating in society, they are difficult to interrupt, they're difficult to stop. Um, what you're talking about here, Erica, is something, and we can come back to this a little bit later, is something called confirmation bias. And so all of us are, the way our brains work is that we often remember things that confirm what we already believe, and then we forget about things that don't. Okay? And so, if you think that, if you think Americans, for instance, are really loud, boisterous people, if that's your stereotype, if that's the idea that you hold, even if you don't know that you hold that idea, you will notice and remember every time you see a loud, boisterous American. But I think I'm going to sneeze again here. Whew, sorry. If every time you notice a loud, boisterous American, you will remember it. And every time that you see an American who's not loud or boisterous, you kind of won't notice it, or you'll forget about it. And so what you already believe, you will, every time you see something that supports what you believe, you will notice it. And then every time you see something that contradicts your belief, you will tend to ignore it. And this is just a factor of how human brains work. It's not a good thing. It gets in the way of us thinking logically and critically about things, but it's a way that the human brain works anyway. Vika says, because they are believing in their views and they're afraid that they'll be wrong. Yeah, that's part of it as well. So people don't really like to, most of us don't really like to admit that we're wrong, right? We don't really like to admit that we believe something that's not true. And if you remember that culture iceberg graphic that I showed you, the deeper that sort of those beliefs go, the more difficult it is to challenge them, right? It's more difficult to either try to convince people that they're wrong, or it's more difficult for people to see that they might be wrong. And so, people, when people hold beliefs, it's really difficult sometimes for them or for us to give those beliefs up. But one of the important things here is confirmation bias. You will notice things that prove what you already think you know, and the things that contradict what you think you know, you won't notice them. Okay? All right. So that was really good work today. I know we're kind of out of time here. We'll pick up the second half of this tomorrow. I'll give you a little more time to read and finish it up, maybe at the beginning of class tomorrow. I also want to talk about these little micro papers that I've put into the syllabus. I'd like to talk about what they look like so that we could start to write one. Okay, so we'll talk about that tomorrow. But until then, maybe I'll leave you because we're out of time. For some of you, I'll see you in 10 minutes in comparative cultures. And for the rest of you, I'll see you tomorrow. Okay, so good work. Thank you for participating in the live chat. That was good. And I'll see y'all tomorrow. Okay, so bye.